So now we learned a lot about Flutter's internals, how it updates the UI, and why we sometimes need keys. Now I want to conclude this section by taking a look at a Dart concept that can be confusing. In this course, we sometimes had a case like this, where we had a list, like let's say numbers, 1, 2, 3, and then we called add and added a new value to this list. And this can be confusing because isn't this a final list? So why can we add new values if it's final? And that's a good question, and it's therefore really important to understand what's going on here. Final simply means that this variable is final, so you can't assign a new value to it. If I would try to set numbers to a different list, like this, I would get an error because this variable is final and it can therefore only be set once. So put in other words, I can't use this assignment operator, this equal sign, again on a variable that is final. This does not work. This here, however, does not assign a new value. Instead, it used the existing value stored in memory, so this existing list stored in memory, and adds a new value to that. It does not store a new value in the variable. The value is the same. It's the same object in memory, the same list. It's just that object in memory that's changed behind the scenes. When assigning a new value, like I tried to do here, I'm actually creating a new list in memory, a totally new object in memory. I'm not editing an existing object, I'm creating a new one, and I can't assign this new object to numbers. That is what final prevents. And that's what's different if I use var instead. With var, I am allowed to assign a new value. This is now possible because with var, we create a variable that can be reassigned, so where you can overwrite the existing value with a new value. You can also still edit an existing value, but you can also overwrite it. That's the difference between final and var. And then we also have const. With const, you also can't assign a new value, but here you also get an error if I open the debug console and restart the app, if you try to edit an existing value in memory. Here we get an error that I can't add to an unmodifiable list. And I'm getting this error here because with const you're telling Dart that it's not just final, but this value also can't be manipulated behind the scenes, essentially. That's what const does here. Now, when we used const on widgets, we're essentially doing the same thing. We're saying that it can't be manipulated behind the scenes, and that's why Flutter is able to reuse those widgets if we use the same widget with the same configuration in different places of our widget tree, because it knows that it can't change in a magical place, and it therefore can't break one part of the app just because it changed in another part. With const, it's clear that this can't happen. And here we're using const in front of a value, whereas here we're using it in front of a variable name, but we could also write this as final numbers equals const like this to make this list unmodifiable and make this variable unmodifiable, but we can also use a shortcut here and add const in front of the variable like this. This makes the value and the variable unmodifiable. With final, we make just the variable unmodifiable, and with var, everything is allowed. So this difference between var, final, and const is really important. And it is important to understand and keep in mind that when you create data with var, for example, this data is stored in memory. So in this case, this list object is stored in memory. This line of code, which you see here, creates a new list object and stores it in memory. And in the end, it's this address of this data in memory that's stored in the variable. That is what happens behind the scenes. Now, if you overwrite the value in the variable like this, a new object is created and stored in memory with a new address, and this new address overwrites the existing address in the existing variable. So in the end, the data in the variable is overwritten, you could say, but technically it's the address. Now the variable points at a different object in memory. In this case here, if the old list, which only included max, was only stored in users and not used anywhere else in the code, Dart would actually recognize that this old list isn't used anymore and would indeed remove it from memory to free up memory again. But Dart does this automatically. This is a process called garbage collecting. So that is what happens if you create new values and store these values in variables. Now, for many objects, you can not just create those objects. You can, for example, not just create a list, but you can also manipulate existing objects, for example, by calling add on a list. And this indeed does not create a new list, but it edits the existing list in memory. The address is the same because the object is the same. It's just some internal data of that object that changed. And therefore the address and the object stays unchanged. It's still the same object in memory, and therefore this is a use case where we could also use final instead of var. Now, speaking of final, as mentioned, if you're using final, you're not allowed to reassign the variable because that is what final prevents. It makes sure that variables are final. They can't get new addresses that they should store. They can't store new values, therefore. But you can absolutely edit existing values in memory. This is allowed with final. And with that, this final const var thing hopefully makes a bit more sense and is a bit less confusing when encountered in code. This is, by the way, also why in KeyStart, when getting these ordered to-dos, I'm creating a copy of my to-dos with the built-in of method that exists on the list class, which is built into Dart, so that I don't change the original list, because sort like add is a method that does change the list on which it is called, but I instead only change the copy, because I don't want to change the original list here. But that's just a side note.